The snow had been falling on Millhaven, Oregon, for so long that people had stopped looking up at the sky. There was nothing to see up there anymore. Nothing was coming. The supply train that should have arrived on December 3rd never did. The one scheduled for December 17th disappeared into the mountains without a trace. Even the emergency shipment the territorial governor had promised in January, the one people had argued over in the general store while Fletcher Crane stood behind his counter, nodding with practiced confidence, that one never came either. 9 weeks. The railroad tracks through the Cascades had been buried under 9 feet of snow for 9 weeks. Millhaven was home to 260 people. Its general store had empty shelves. Its children were getting quiet in the way children only get quiet when something is wrong that adults cannot fix. Its old men sat near their stoves and did not say much. The hunger had arrived in stages the way serious things always do first, as inconvenience, then as worry, then as a weight that sat in every room of every house and would not be asked to leave. On a hillside east of town, where the morning sun struck first and stayed longest, a woman named Hazel Warren opened the door of her drying shed. She stood in the doorway for a moment and let her eyes move across what 3 years of patient work had built. Floor to ceiling shelving, every level filled, cloth sacks tied at the neck, wooden boxes sealed and labeled in her careful handwriting, 232 pounds of dried fruit organized by type by date by the season that had produced it. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the specific weight of what she was looking at. Then she closed the door, adjusted her shawl against the cold, and walked to the stable where her bay mare, Maple, was eating hay with the calm of a creature that had never once doubted the woman who cared for her. Hazel pressed her forehead against the warm curve of Maple's neck. She allowed herself one moment, just one, of something close to exhaustion. Then she straightened up. "Well, old girl," she said softly, "I expect they'll be coming soon." To understand who Hazel Warren was and why that shed was full when every shelf in town was empty, you have to go back 4 years. You have to go back to a morning in the spring of 1885 in the logging camps along the Willamette Valley, and to a man named George Warren who kissed his wife before dawn and went out to do the work that had always been done and would, he assumed, continue to be done for many years yet to come. George Warren was 43 years old, a timber worker with steady hands and a good reputation among the men who worked alongside him. He was the kind of man who remembered names, who checked on older workers when the weather turned, who had once carried an injured colleague 3 miles through heavy timber without complaint. He was not a complicated man. He was a good one, which is rarer. That morning he poured his coffee while Hazel sliced bread at the counter. He stood by the window looking out at the gray pre-dawn light, and he said something ordinary. Later, Hazel could not remember exactly what it was. Something about the day or the week, or whether they needed more lamp oil. Something with no weight to it at all. He picked up his hat. He walked out the door. That was the last ordinary thing. A Douglas fir came down wrong. These things happen in timber work. They happen with a speed that makes reasoning useless, with a finality that makes protest absurd. The tree struck George across the chest. He lived long enough to be carried to a place where he could lie still, and in that time he said 2 things to the men around him. The first was that he loved his wife. The second was to ask them to tell her to forgive the tree. She did both. Forgiving the tree came quickly. It was, after all, only a tree. It had not meant anything by what it did. Forgiving George for leaving her, for not being more careful, for not somehow finding a way to still be standing in the kitchen at 70 pouring coffee. By morning light, that forgiveness came much more slowly. She never quite finished it, but she made her peace with the unfinished nature of it, and that was enough. 2 weeks after the funeral, a company foreman named Aldrich came to her door. He had a plain envelope in his hand and an expression on his face that suggested he was hoping she would not cause trouble. The envelope contained $200, which was the timber company's acknowledgement that a man's life had been spent in their service, and that $200 was what that service had been worth. Hazel took the envelope. She did not cause trouble. She did not cry. She thanked him and showed him to the door, and then she sat down at the kitchen table and looked at the envelope for a long time. $200. She turned it over in her hands. Then she got up and found her map. What she was looking for was not comfort, and it was not familiarity. She had grown up in the Willamette Valley, in the orchard country, where her father grew apples and pears in rows that ran straight as sentences all the way to the hills. She could have gone back there. People would have understood if she had. A widow returning home was a story people knew how to receive. But Hazel was her mother's daughter, and her mother, Constance Aldridge, had come from the hill country of Tennessee, where the understanding of food preservation was not a domestic skill. It was the margin between a family that made it through winter and a family that did not. Constance could dry can pickle smoke and ferment the abundance of summer into stores that would last through any winter, however long, however hard. She had learned from her own mother, who had learned from hers, a chain of knowledge, going back through generations of women whose names had not been preserved in any record, but whose hands had kept people alive through seasons that would otherwise have killed them. Hazel had absorbed this knowledge the way children absorb language, not through study, but through proximity and repetition. By the time she was 12, she could run a drying operation that would have impressed a commercial enterprise. By 20, she could look at a piece of fruit and know its sugar content by eye, its moisture level by touch, the precise window of time during which it could be dried to perfect preservation rather than ruined by overdoing it. It was knowledge that lived in her fingers as much as in her mind, and looking at her map that day, what she saw was not sentiment. She saw geography. She saw the terrain markings around a small settlement called Mill Haven in the foothills of the Cascades, east-facing slopes, a valley bottom that had been settled by homesteaders 20 years earlier. She saw what those terrain markings meant: wild fruit, abandoned orchards, hillsides full of things that were being wasted. She made her decision before she finished reading the description, not a decision about grief or about solitude or about what a widow was supposed to do, a decision about work, about what her hands knew, about what those hills might offer to someone who knew what to do with them. She folded the map. She packed 2 trunks and a crate of tools. She loaded Maple into a stock car and rode the train east into the mountains. She arrived in Mill Haven on a gray October afternoon in 1885, 44 years old, $200 in her pocket, and a kind of clarity about her purpose that most people spend their whole lives trying to find. Mill Haven, in the autumn of 1885, was a town that had been built on confidence. The confidence of timber money, of regular supply trains from Portland, of a general store that could reliably stock whatever a family needed if they had the wages to pay for it. 260 people had arranged their lives around this confidence. It was not complacency exactly. It was just the practical assumption of people whose needs had always been met by a system that had never in their experience failed them. The center of that system was Fletcher Crane. Crane's general store occupied the largest corner lot in town, its sign freshly painted, its windows dressed with goods, arranged in a display that said, without needing to say it in words, that this establishment was the source, the authority, the place through which all things necessary passed. Crane was 52 years old, red-bearded with small eyes that were always moving, always calculating. He had run the store for 12 years. He set the prices, he extended credit, he decided in the quiet way that men of commercial power decide things who prospered and who found things difficult. When Hazel arrived in town and asked about land, it was Crane she spoke to first, because Crane was involved in most things in Mill Haven that involved money changing hands. He looked her over with the automatic assessment of a man who had learned to sort arrivals quickly. A widow, middle-aged, no family visible. He quoted her the weekly rate for the boarding house as if this was the obvious and only question. Hazel said she was looking to buy land. Something shifted in his expression, a faint recalibration. He named a parcel on the east hillside above town, 2 acres steep, rocky, unsuitable for crops or grazing. He quoted $30, which was approximately what he thought the paper the deed was written on was worth. Hazel looked toward the hillside. She did not look at it the way a person buying land looks at land, calculating what might be built or grown there. She looked at it the way someone who knows a language looks at a text written in that language. She was reading something in the slope of the ground, the angle of the morning sun, the way the afternoon breeze came off the ridge. "I'll take it," she said. Crane took her money and handed her the deed. As she turned to leave, something in him stayed watching, not the watching of a man who respects what he sees not yet, the watching of a man who has filed something away for later consideration. The 2 acres Hazel had purchased were by every ordinary measure useless. The slope was too steep for a horse to work. The rock came through the soil in gray outcroppings that would break a plow. There was nowhere on that hillside that could be used for the conventional purposes for which land was usually purchased, but it received the morning sun before anywhere else in the valley, and in the afternoon a steady breeze came off the ridge and swept the slope from east to west with the reliability of a clock. Heat and moving air, that was what Hazel's mother had taught her. That was what 3 generations of Tennessee hill women had understood, and what no commercial operation in Portland had ever quite mastered. Fruit dries in heat and moving air, not in heat alone. Heat alone cooks. Cooking destroys the nutrients that make preserved fruit worth eating. Heat combined with constant airflow, kept low, kept steady, kept patient. That is what transforms summer abundance into something that can sit on a shelf for years and still nourish a person fully when nothing else is available. She built the drying shed before she built her house. This was not an oversight. It was a statement of priorities that she did not bother to explain to anyone, though it puzzled people considerably. The shed was 7 meters long and 3 meters wide, built from milled lumber with a louvered wall construction that allowed air to circulate freely through the interior at all times. The roof was cedar shingles, which kept rain out without trapping moisture inside. Interior shelving ran at 3 heights waist-shoulder and overhead each level, holding sliding frames of stretched gauze fabric. These frames loaded and unloaded independently, which meant fruit at different stages of drying could be managed without disturbing pieces that were further along. A small stone firebox at the north end provided supplemental heat for the damp autumn days when sun alone was insufficient. The whole structure was oriented precisely to the prevailing breeze. She built it in 11 days, working alone from first light until she could no longer see. The men of Millhaven passed on the road below and looked up at the unfamiliar structure taking shape on the hillside. None of them asked if she needed help. On the 3rd day, a woman appeared at the edge of the clearing with a jug of cold water. Ruth Calloway was 38 years old, a widow herself with 2 children and a small farmstead further up the hill. She had the look of someone who has learned to make do and has made her peace with that learning. She held out the water jug and looked at what Hazel was building. "What is it?" she asked. Hazel accepted the water and gave a brief, accurate explanation. The principle of the thing, the reason for the louvers, the relationship between airflow and temperature, and the resulting quality of dried fruit that could last years rather than months. Ruth listened without the expression that most people in Millhaven would have worn, which was the expression of someone hearing something that does not fit into their existing understanding and who has decided for the sake of convenience that it is therefore not worth taking seriously. Ruth simply listened, asked one clarifying question about the frames, and then nodded. "That makes sense," she said. She came back the next day with more water and stayed long enough to help lift a shelf frame into position. She did not become a devoted helper or a constant presence, but she became, in the quiet way that certain people become things for one another, a witness. And in Millhaven, in the autumn of 1885, a witness was more than Hazel had expected to find. The house came second. 1 room, a sleeping loft, a fieldstone fireplace, a covered porch that faced the valley, a lean-to stable attached to the north wall for maple snug and dry. Total cost of land shed and house $74. Hazel had $126 remaining. She had done the math before she arrived. That first autumn, Hazel worked from before sunrise until after dark every day for 6 weeks. The hillsides around Millhaven were producing more fruit than anyone was paying attention to. Wild plum in the creek bottoms, wild apple in the old homesteader clearings, trees that had been planted 30 years earlier and abandoned when the families who planted them moved on, still producing abundantly, every year their fruit falling to rot on the ground because no one thought it worth the effort to gather. Service, berries on the high meadows, blackberries that had swallowed every fence line for a mile in each direction, heavy and dark and untouched. Millhaven was drowning in fruit that no one valued. Hazel valued it extremely. She loaded Maple's sled with harvested fruit and hauled it up the hill in loads, sorting on the way, keeping the firm and ripe fruit separate from the overripe, cutting away any bruised or damaged sections with the quick precision of a woman who has been doing this since childhood, using every good ounce and wasting nothing. The technique for each fruit was specific and had been worked out over decades of trial by the women who had handed this knowledge down to her. Apples cored, peeled, sliced a 1/4 inch thick, dipped briefly in salt water to prevent browning, laid in the frames with space between each piece. Pears halved cored, brushed with a thin wash of honey that sweetened them further and gave the dried surface a golden color. Plums halved and pitted, placed cut side up so moisture could escape from the flesh evenly. Cherries kept whole stems removed, dried at the lowest possible temperature to preserve both color and flavor. By late October, the first batch was ready. 18 pounds of dried apple rings, each piece the color and texture of soft leather, concentrated with sweetness that hit the tongue like a memory of summer. Hazel carried a sample down to Fletcher Crane's store. She wanted to sell them. The store was busy that afternoon, 3 or 4 customers moving between the shelves, a woman waiting at the counter. Crane looked up from his ledger when Hazel came in, recognized her, and returned his gaze to the ledger in a way that made clear he was in the middle of something more important. When she approached the counter and laid the cloth bag of apple rings down between them, he picked up one ring, held it to the light, smelled it, bent it between 2 thick fingers with the detached assessment of someone handling an unfamiliar material. "Dried fruit," he said flatly. "Dried apple," Hazel said, "from the old Henderson orchard above the creek. I have 18 pounds of first-quality rings, and I expect to have considerably more by spring. I would like to sell them from a table outside your door on market days." The small eyes moved across her face, then across the apple ring, then back to her face. She could see him deciding not what was true, but what was useful. He was a man who had learned that what was useful and what was true were not always the same thing. He set the apple ring down on the counter. "Mrs. Warren," he began in the tone of someone about to explain something to a person of limited understanding. "I have everything this town needs in this store. That includes dried fruit when the supply train brings it from Portland, real dried fruit from real companies in proper packaging. What you're offering here," he moved one hand in a dismissive arc, "it's homemade. People want what they know. They want labels and brands. They want to know who made it and where it came from. They don't want something cooked in a shed by a widow with time on her hands." "It isn't cooked," Hazel said quietly. "It's dried. There's a considerable difference." Crane leaned forward slightly. "The answer is no, Mrs. Warren. You may not set up a table outside my store. It would give the wrong impression." A man standing at the shelves nearby, Walt Briggs, 58 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the particular silence of a man who has spent decades in timber work and has learned that silence is usually more useful than speaking, looked up briefly from the tin of coffee he was examining. He watched Hazel's face for a moment. Then he looked at the bag of apple rings on the counter. Then he looked away. Hazel picked up the cloth bag. She did not argue. She did not explain further. She thanked Crane for his time, which was the kind of courtesy that made a refusal feel more complete rather than less, and she walked out. As the door closed behind her, Crane stood looking at it for a moment. Then he turned to the young man who helped him in the store. "Note down what she was doing to those apples before she put them in the frame, he said in a different voice than the one he had been using, "The saltwater step. And whatever she did with the honey on the pears, just write it down." It was not an admission of interest, it was a precaution. Fletcher Crane was a careful man. Walt Briggs set the coffee tin back on the shelf. He purchased a sack of flour, nodded to Crane, and walked out. On the road, he paused for a moment and looked up toward the east hillside where smoke was rising from what he now knew was not a cabin, but a drying shed. He stood there long enough that it could not have been accidental. Then he walked on. The rejection at Crane's store was the first refusal. The social campaign was the second kind, and in some ways the more persistent one. Sawyer Mills owned the sawmill that employed half the men in Millhaven. He was 48, thick in the neck, a man who had built something real and had never quite forgiven people who had not built the same thing for failing to share his understanding of what real meant. He announced in the saloon with the expansiveness of a man performing for an audience that the widow's fruit business was a small and sad venture born of a small and sad life. The men around him laughed, including Walt Briggs, who would remember that laugh later with a particular quality of shame. Mills's wife, Lucretia, was 44 trim, always dressed with careful precision, with a voice that was always soft and always somehow cutting. She convened a meeting of the Church Women's Auxiliary and guided the discussion toward Hazel Warren with the practiced indirection of someone who understands that the most effective verdicts are the ones that appear to arrive naturally. The conclusion the group reached with Lucretia's gentle steering was that Hazel's activities were eccentric, possibly unhealthy, and indicative of a mind disturbed by grief. The poor creature, Lucretia told her circle, has clearly been affected by the loss of her husband. Drying hundreds of pounds of fruit in a hillside shed borders on mania. The shed acquired a name, Widow's Madhouse. It spread through the town with the efficiency that names always spread when they capture something people already half believe. Ruth heard it first and brought it to Hazel on a gray November afternoon. She told it straight the way she always told things, without softening it into something easier to receive. Hazel stood in the doorway of the shed and looked at the valley below for a moment. Then she went inside and took the tally from the shelf. She noted the current weight. She thought about what the pear trees on the north slope might produce if properly tended. She lifted 9 pounds of dried pear from the most recent batch and added them to the inventory, entering the figure in the ledger in her careful hand. Ruth watched from the doorway. "You don't want to say anything to them." Hazel closed the ledger. "Mockery is the tax that lazy people pay to busy ones," she said. "I don't have time to go collect it." She went back to work. Through 1886 and into 1887, she expanded the operation with the methodical patience of someone following a plan rather than reacting to circumstances. She planted 4 apple trees and 3 pear trees on her steep hillside, small whips that would take years to bear, but that were investments in a future she intended to still be present for. She trained blackberries along a south-facing fence line, maximizing sun exposure and making harvest practical. She established an exchange with 2 families further up the valley, trading dried fruit for access to their service berry patches. Her methods became more refined with each season. She discovered that plums dried at slightly lower heat for longer periods produce prunes with better texture and a sweeter, more complex flavor. She learned that cherries dried on damp days over the open firebox with the door left ajar for cross-ventilation retained more of their color than cherries dried in direct sun. She developed a technique for pressing dried service berries into dense cakes wrapped in wax cloth that were extraordinarily nutritious, highly portable, and stable for years in proper storage conditions. Her storage facility expanded to match. The drying shed was for processing. Behind her cabin, she excavated a separate cool room lined with cedar planking to repel moisture and insects. Dried fruit went into cloth sacks, sealed inside wooden boxes labeled with contents and preparation date. The ledger tracked every pound that came in and every pound that went out or was consumed. By the autumn of 1888, that ledger recorded a reserve of 232 pounds. Crane heard about the number from one of his customers and repeated it in his store, shaking his head slowly, performing bewilderment for whoever was listening. 230 pounds of dried fruit, he said. The woman has completely lost her head. Who needs 230 pounds of fruit? They'll bury her in prunes before they put her in the ground. Sawyer Mills, hearing the same number reported at the saloon, laughed until his eyes watered. Maybe she wants to open a shop, he said. Draymond's Dry Goods specializing in madness by the pound. Hazel heard both comments through Ruth, who reported them with the neutrality of someone delivering weather information. Hazel opened the ledger. She added 9 more pounds of dried pear to the reserve. She updated the tally and closed the book. She said nothing. Through the long gray autumn of 1888, as the rains came heavier than anyone could remember, and the mountain passes turned soft, and the roads into Millhaven became channels of standing mud, the town below her hillside continued its arrangements with the world it had always known. Men went to the mill. Families bought their provisions from Crane's store. The supply train schedules posted at the station showed regular service through the winter, as always printed by men in Portland offices who had, as far as Hazel could determine, never actually seen a Cascades winter from the inside. She completed her final harvest in October. She made her last entry in the ledger. She closed the shed for the season. Then she sat on her porch in the evening and looked at the lights of Millhaven below, and she listened to Maple moving quietly in the stable beside the cabin wall, and she thought about a thing her mother had once told her years ago on an autumn afternoon in Tennessee when the canning was done and the cellar was full, and Constance had sat down for the first time in weeks and looked at her daughter with an expression that was not quite pride and not quite worry, but something that combined both. "The shelf doesn't fill itself," Constance had said, "and a train schedule is just paper. Paper is not food." The lights in the valley were warm against the dark. Hazel watched them until the cold drove her inside. Below her in the town, whose name she had chosen because of what she read in a topographic map and not because anyone there had asked her to come, the confidence that had kept Millhaven comfortable through every winter it had ever known was about to encounter something it had no experience with. The supply train scheduled for December 3rd was already not going to come. The men in the Portland offices had already begun to understand that the Cascades were doing something this year that the Cascades had not done in recorded memory. The locomotive assigned to clear the tracks was frozen solid at a depot 100 miles west, its boiler useless in the cold. Nobody in Millhaven knew any of this yet. Hazel did not know it either, not specifically, but she had built a shed on a hillside and filled it with 232 pounds of dried fruit and kept a ledger that accounted for every ounce. And in the end, the specific knowledge of what was coming mattered less than the habit of preparing for what might come regardless. The summer always ends. The trains are not always reliable. The only food you can count on in a crisis is the food you put away yourself. Her mother had known this. Her grandmother had known it before that. The women of the Tennessee Hill Country had known it for generations, not because they were prophets, but because they were paying attention. Hazel Warren was paying attention, and 232 pounds of summer were waiting in the dark of the shed, labeled and counted and ready. The first train that did not come did not frighten anyone. Delays happen in winter. Everybody knew this. A late December storm could push a scheduled arrival back by 2 or 3 days without any real consequence, because Crane's store had started the season well stocked, and 2 or 3 days was nothing. People noted the absence the way you note a minor inconvenience, with a small adjustment of plans and a reasonable expectation that things would sort themselves out shortly. The second train that did not come made people nervous. The third was supposed to arrive on December 31st, the last day of the year, and it was carrying not only general supplies, but the special Christmas orders that families had placed with Crane 6 weeks earlier. Candy, good coffee, bolts of fabric that women had been waiting for, a particular brand of tobacco that Walt Briggs had ordered specifically because it was what his father had smoked, and he allowed himself 1 tin of it each winter as a kind of private acknowledgement of the years passing. When the 31st came and went without the sound of a locomotive whistle in the valley, the nervousness that had been building for 2 weeks became something harder and colder. January arrived. No train. The mountain passes through the Cascades were buried under 9 feet of snow. The locomotives assigned to clear the tracks were frozen at a depot 100 miles west, their boilers useless, their crews waiting for a thaw that was not coming. The territorial governor sent word through the last rider, who had managed to get through before the passes closed entirely, that an emergency resupply was being organized. People in Millhaven received this news and held on to it the way you hold on to the side of something when you feel the ground shifting. By mid-January, the holding on had become harder. Crane's store had begun the winter in good condition. He had ordered heavily in October, as he always did, because he understood the business of frontier supply and because his reputation was built on reliability. The shelves that had been full in November were becoming something else now, and the change was happening faster than he had told anyone, including himself, that it would. Flour went first. It always did. Flour was the foundation of everything a frontier kitchen produced, and when it began to run low, the effect spread through every meal in every house in Millhaven, like a crack spreading through ice. Crane had 2 sacks left when he finally stopped selling it by the bag and began selling it by the cup, then by the half cup. Then he stopped selling it altogether and kept what remained behind the counter. Sugar disappeared, coffee followed, and this particular loss landed differently among the men. Walt Briggs came in on a Tuesday morning in January and asked for a pound of coffee. Crane looked at him from behind the counter with an expression that had lost most of its commercial confidence and had taken on something Briggs had never seen on the man's face before, something that resembled from a distance honesty. "I have 4 pounds left," Crane said. "For the store, I'm rationing it." Walt Briggs stood in front of the counter and looked at Fletcher Crane for a long moment. 12 years he had been buying provisions in this store. 12 years he had watched Crane manage the business with the ease of a man who had never seriously doubted his own competence. "You told me in December the train would come," Briggs said. His voice was level, the way a man's voice gets level when he is working to keep something under control. "It will come," Crane said, but his voice did not carry the same weight it had carried in December. It carried the weight of a man saying something because it needs to be said, not because he is certain of it. Briggs looked at the half-empty shelves. He looked at the handwritten price list on the board behind Crane's head, where flour had been crossed out twice and the current price written over the previous one, the numbers climbing in a way that told their own story. He had seen the price of a sack of flour go from $1 to $5 to $8 in the space of 3 weeks. He had counted his money the night before and understood for the first time in his adult working life that counting money carefully was something he needed to do. He turned and walked out without buying anything. Outside, he stood on the road in the cold and looked up at the east hillside. The smoke from Hazel Warren's cabin was visible against the gray sky. The drying shed was dark, its door shut against the cold. He had stood in that store and laughed when Sawyer Mills called her life small and sad. He thought about that now. He walked home. By the end of January, the hunger was inside the houses. Not the sharp, dramatic hunger of a siege, but the slow, grinding kind, the kind that reduces a meal from 3 to 2 and then from 2 to 1, the kind that makes mothers eat nothing so their children can eat something, the kind that makes old men sit very still and very quiet because movement costs calories they cannot replace. 2 people died in February. Garfield Stone was a retired timber worker, 61 years old, who had lived alone in a cabin at the south end of town since his wife passed 3 years earlier. He was the kind of man who would not ask for help. His firewood pile was full. His cabin was warm. His pantry was empty. He had apparently decided in the specific, quiet way that proud and solitary old men sometimes decide things that he would not be a burden to anyone. A neighbor found him on a Thursday morning, sitting in his chair near the stove gone. Walt Briggs had worked beside Garfield Stone for 22 years. They had shared campfires and bad weather and the particular exhaustion that comes from hard, physical labor sustained over decades. He heard the news on the same Thursday morning, and he stood outside his own door in the cold without moving for a long time. He had enough food for perhaps another week. He had been telling himself it was sufficient. He stopped telling himself that after he heard about Garfield Stone. The second death was Clara Navarro, 4 years old, the youngest child of a family that had come to Millhaven 2 years earlier. She had been weakening since January. Her mother had been feeding her what she could find, which was less and less, and by February there was almost nothing left to give. Clara died on a Tuesday evening. Her mother sat beside her through the night, and the sound that came from that house was the sound of a grief that has no language adequate to it. Ruth Calloway heard about both deaths within hours of each one. She was on the hillside before first light the following morning, her boots crunching through the frozen crust of the snow on the path she had worn between her farmstead and Hazel's cabin over 4 years of visiting. She knocked on the door of the drying shed rather than the cabin because she knew where Hazel would be. Hazel opened the door. Ruth's face told her before any words did. She listened to both stories without moving, standing in the entrance of the shed with 232 pounds of preserved summer behind her. When Ruth finished, Hazel put one hand flat against the shelving beside her. The wood was cold. The bags of dried fruit were exactly as she had packed them, exactly as the ledger described them, exactly sufficient. She had been watching the trains fail to arrive. She had been watching the price board in Crane's store through Ruth's reports, the numbers climbing with the desperation of a man trying to maintain control of something that was escaping him. She had watched Crane's attempt to purchase her stores through the young Aldrich boy, and she had refused it for reasons she had thought about carefully and stood behind completely. But she had told herself she was waiting for the right moment. She had told herself she needed to be strategic. Garfield Stone had been strategic about his firewood. Clara Navarro had been 4 years old. "Help me load maple," Hazel said. Ruth did not ask questions. She had been waiting for this sentence for longer than she would have admitted. Together they worked in the pre-dawn dark, pulling sacks from the shelves, checking the ledger against what they were taking, loading the wooden panniers across Maple's broad back with 45 pounds of dried apple, dried pear, dried plum, dried cherry, and the dense serviceberry cakes that Hazel had been pressing since autumn. They were almost finished when the shed door opened behind them, letting in the cold. Ruth turned. Hazel kept loading. It was Deputy Tom Hale. Hale was 35, lean, with a face that had the quality of a man who was in the process of deciding something and had not finished deciding. He held a folded piece of paper in one hand. He was not pointing it at anything. He was holding it the way a person holds something they are not entirely sure they want to have. "Mrs. Warren," he said. His voice had the particular flatness of official business, but underneath the flatness, there was something else. "I have an inspection order, food safety and sanitation standards. Mr. Crane filed a complaint about unlicensed food preparation on an unregistered premises." Hazel straightened up from the pannier. She looked at Hale for a moment, then she reached past him to the small shelf beside the door where the ledger lived, and she picked it up and held it out toward him. "Come in then," she said. Hale stepped into the shed. In his years as deputy, he had been in barns and cellars and smoke houses and root cellars of every kind. He had never been in anything like this. The shelves ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls. Every surface was occupied. The wooden boxes were labeled in a clear, consistent hand. The cloth sacks were tied at the neck and marked with dates. The smell of the place was extraordinary, sweet and dry and ancient, like the concentrated essence of every summer orchard he had ever walked through as a boy. He stood in the middle of it and looked at the ledger Hazel held out to him. She opened it to the first page and turned it slowly. Every entry dated, every pound accounted for every variety, recorded the preparation method, noted in abbreviated form, beside each entry. He had been sent here to find a violation. He understood that clearly. Crane had written the inspection order himself in the back room of his store and handed it to Hale with the expression of a man completing an obvious formality. There was nothing to violate. There was only order and precision and a level of systematic care that made his inspection order feel in his hand like the piece of paper it was. He turned the pages slowly. Hazel stood and waited. Ruth stood by the door and watched Hale's face. When he reached the final page, he closed the ledger carefully and handed it back. He looked at Hazel. She looked at him. The moment between them was not hostile. It was the moment between two people who both understand what is actually happening and have arrived at the same conclusion about it from opposite directions. "Everything looks to be in order, Mrs. Warren," he said. He folded the inspection order and put it in his coat pocket. He walked out of the shed without looking back. On the path down the hillside, he stopped once and stood with his back to the shed, looking at the town below. The lights were few this early. The smoke from the chimneys was thin. He had a choice to make about what he told Crane, and he understood it was a real choice, not a bureaucratic one. He walked the rest of the way down the hill slowly. 3 days after Hale's visit, Ruth came up the hill in the middle of the afternoon, which was unusual. She normally came in the morning. Hazel looked at her face and set down the harness she was mending. "There's a boy at your gate," Ruth said. "He says he's from Mr. Crane. He has a letter." The boy's name was young Aldrich. He was 19, the son of the foreman who had come to Hazel's door with the $200 envelope 4 years earlier. He had his father's careful face and his father's way of delivering messages that other people had written, which was to hold them out and step back slightly, as if creating distance between himself and the contents. Hazel read the letter standing in the cold outside her gate, while young Aldrich waited. Crane's handwriting was precise. The letter made a formal offer to purchase the entire contents of her storage at a fair market price. Crane would take responsibility for distribution to the town's residents. He would manage the process through the store, ensuring orderly and equitable access. He would, the letter said, ensure that everyone received their fair share. Hazel read it twice. She thought about the price board in Crane's store with the climbing numbers. She thought about the orderly and equitable access Crane had provided to the last of the flour, which had involved a price that doubled 3 times in as many weeks. She thought about who Crane would decide to give first access to and on what terms and in what order. She thought about Garfield Stone. She folded the letter. "Tell Mr. Crane no," she said. Young Aldrich looked at her. Something moved across his face that was not quite surprise. He had expected this answer, she realized. He had known before he came up the hill what she would say, and the fact that he had come anyway said something about him that she noted without comment. "He won't be pleased," young Aldrich said, not as a threat, as a fact delivered with the slight resignation of a young man who has to go back and deliver an unpleasant message to an unpleasant recipient. "I know," Hazel said. "Is there anything else?" There was not. He went back down the hill, walking in the same careful way his father always had, as if each step needed to be considered before being taken. Hazel went back inside the shed. She stood among the shelves for a while. She had made the right decision. She was certain of that. If Crane controlled the distribution, he would control the terms of it, and the terms he chose would not be the terms she had in mind. She had watched him long enough to know exactly what fair market price meant to Fletcher Crane and what it meant to the families on the far end of town who had been stretching their last supplies for 3 weeks. But there was a discomfort in the certainty. She had been right to refuse. She had also been holding 232 pounds of food on a hillside, while people in the valley below her had been getting quietly thinner. She had been waiting for the right moment, but the right moment was a calculation, and calculations had a cost that fell on someone else while you were making them. She picked up the ledger. She looked at the final entry, 232 pounds. She thought about Thomas Calloway, Ruth's son, 7 years old, who had sat in her kitchen 2 weeks earlier with the color of chalk in his face and who had eaten warm dried apple in water and slept for 2 hours and woken up with his cheeks showing something closer to their natural color. She had known then what she was looking at. She had known what the dried fruit could do for a body that had been running on insufficient food for weeks. She had known it, and she had stood in the kitchen and watched the boy sleep and felt the distance between the knowledge and the action of it as a specific kind of weight. She had told herself she was being careful. She had told herself strategic patience was not the same as inaction. She set the ledger down on the shelf. She walked to the stable. Maple looked up from the hay with the patient attentiveness she always had when Hazel came in with a purposeful step. "We're going down tomorrow," Hazel said. She stood in the stable in the dark for a while, her hand on Maple's neck, feeling the warmth of the horse against the cold of the evening. Outside, the wind was picking up off the ridge. In the valley below, the lights in the houses were going out earlier than they had ever gone out in any winter she had observed from this hillside, because people were going to bed to stay warm rather than burning oil they needed to save. She thought about Constance, who had taught her everything she knew about this work, about the autumn afternoons in Tennessee, when the canning was done and the cellar was full and the winter could come whenever it chose, because they were ready for it. Constance had never talked about readiness as a form of superiority. She had talked about it as a form of care. Care for the people who depended on you. Care for the future that was coming, regardless of whether you had prepared for it. The care Hazel had been exercising had been the care of preservation, of strategic patience, of protecting what she had built from the man who would have taken it and turned it into a transaction. That care had been correct as far as it went. It had not gone far enough. 2 people were dead. One of them had been 61 years old and proud, and she could not have saved him with dried fruit any more than she could have saved him with anything else. But the other had been 4 years old, and 4-year-olds do not die of pride. She went inside and packed the panniers in the dark by feel the way her mother had taught her to pack them, so she would know where everything was without needing light. 45 pounds for the first day. She would come back for more the day after, and the day after that for as many days as it took. The ledger said 232 pounds. She would give every ounce of it if she needed to. She did not sleep much that night. She lay in the loft listening to Maple moving in the stable below and thinking about the town below the hill and about the difference between the moment when you finally act and the moment when you should have. Before first light, she rose. She dressed in the dark. She loaded Maple in the stable, adjusting the panniers until they sat evenly on both sides of the mare's broad back. She put on her heaviest shawl, the gray one George had given her in the 2nd year of their marriage, because he said the blue one she had was not warm enough for Oregon winters, and he would not have her cold. She took the horse's lead and walked out into the frozen morning. The path down the hillside was glazed with ice. She went slowly, keeping one hand on Maple's neck, the horse picking her footing with the deliberate care she always showed on difficult ground. The valley opened below them as they descended, the town still dark smoke beginning to rise from a few chimneys in the gray pre-dawn air. She stopped in front of Fletcher Crane's store. The same door, the same sign, the same windows that had been dressed with goods, arranged to communicate certainty and sufficiency. The shelves behind those windows were visible now in the early light, and what they communicated was different from what they had communicated 3 years ago when she had walked through that door with a cloth bag of apple rings and a reasonable request that had been refused in front of witnesses. She set up a table from 2 boards and a pair of sawhorses she had brought down on the sled behind Maple. She arranged the panniers. She set out the dried fruit by variety, the apple rings in one section, the pear halves beside them, the dark plums, the cherries, and the service berry cakes stacked at the end. Then she stood behind the table and waited. Behind the window of his store, hidden by the curtain he had not pulled fully across, Fletcher Crane stood and watched her. His face in the gray light was not easy to read. His expression had the quality of a man who has been rehearsing something for weeks and has just realized the rehearsal is over. At the far end of the road, half in the shadow of the building on the corner, Walt Briggs stood with his hands in his coat pockets and watched from a distance. He had been on his way to check his firewood and had stopped when he saw the figure on the hillside coming down in the early dark. He recognized Maple first, then Hazel, then understood what was happening. He stood where he was and watched. The morning light grew. The town began to stir. Smoke thickened from the chimneys. A door opened somewhere on the south side of the street. Then a small figure appeared at the near end of the road, a boy, perhaps 10 years old, his wool cap pulled low, his coat buttoned to the throat, his face thin in the winter light. He saw the table. He stopped. He looked at the dried fruit laid out on the boards in the early morning cold, and his expression was the expression of someone who has encountered something that does not fit into the category of possible things. Hazel looked at him. She kept her voice the way she kept her hands when she was working steady and unhurried. "Come on," she said. "Take what you need. It's free." The boy looked at her. He looked at the fruit. He looked at her again, the specific look of a child who has been disappointed enough times that he checks twice before believing anything good. Then he reached out and took a double handful of dried apple rings and ran. In less than an hour, Millhaven knew. They came the way water comes through a crack in a dam, first one thin stream, and then before you can measure it, everything at once. The boy with the wool cap had run to the end of the road and disappeared, and then the road was no longer empty. They came in the order that hunger arranges people, the ones with the least first, because they had been watching longer, waiting more carefully, hoping with the particular intensity of those who have the least room to be disappointed. A woman carrying an infant pressed against her chest, moving fast, her breath coming in clouds in the cold air. 2 children ahead of their mother sent first because she thought they might be refused, less readily than an adult. An old man with a cane who moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who has been conserving every calorie for days. Hazel worked behind the table with the unhurried precision of someone who has done this kind of work before, which she had for most of her adult life, in the sense that all work of feeding and preserving is finally the same work. She measured portions by family size, asking each person how many were at home, and then packing accordingly into the cloth bags she had brought with the panniers. She showed each person briefly how to soften the dried fruit in warm water, how to cook it down into a thick compote that would stretch further and satisfy more than eating it dry. She held up the serviceberry cakes and explained that one cake the size of a man's palm contained enough concentrated energy for a full day of hard work. She said these things once to each person patiently, clearly, without condescension. She did not say not once that she had been right. She did not look toward Crane's window. She did not perform anything. She was simply there behind a table made of boards and sawhorses, doing what needed to be done. By mid-morning, more than 40 people had come. By noon, the number was closer to 80. Ruth arrived at the table at 9 o'clock with a sled carrying potatoes from her root cellar and a crate of eggs from her hens, which had kept laying through the winter in the small, warm henhouse Ruth had built against her cabin's south wall, and these things Hazel added to what she was distributing, dividing them by the same calculation of family size and need. Walt Briggs stood at the corner of the building across the road for most of the morning. He did not approach the table. He watched people receive food from a woman he had laughed at in a saloon, and he did not approach the table. At some point in the late morning, a man named Cal Merritt pushed toward the front of the line and said loudly, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, that Hazel should give more, that she had a whole shed full up on that hill, and people were suffering. He said it with the righteousness of a man who has confused his own hunger with a moral argument. Hazel looked at him. She did not raise her voice. "I'm measuring by family size so everyone gets through this week," she said. "I'll be back tomorrow with the same amount, and the day after." She paused. "Is there a family at home, Mr. Merritt?" He told her. She measured his portion. She handed it across the table. He took it and moved on, and the people behind him in the line watched the exchange with the quiet attentiveness of people who are judging whether the person in front of them can be trusted and who have reached a conclusion. Fletcher Crane stayed behind his window. He had been behind it since before first light, since he had watched Hazel come down the frozen hillside with Maple and set up her table in front of his store. He had watched his neighbors and customers walk past his locked door to stand in line at a table made of scrap lumber. He had watched 40 years of commercial logic, the logic that said value was established by scarcity, that authority came from being the source, that a town's respect followed. Whoever controlled the necessities he had watched, all of it become irrelevant in a single morning, not through any force or argument or legal challenge, but through the simple fact of a woman with food standing in a place where people were hungry. He did not open his store that day. Sawyer Mills did not come out of his house. The second day, Hazel came back with another 45 pounds, and the third day, and the day after that, Ruth came with her each morning, bringing whatever the farmstead could contribute. The families on the upper hillside, the ones who had been trading access to their berry patches for dried fruit since 1886, sent down what they had. The distribution table became something the town organized itself around, not because anyone decided this was how it would be, but because a center had formed, and people naturally moved toward it. On the 8th day, Walt Briggs walked down to the table at first light before most people had arrived. He stood at the end of the empty table and waited. When Hazel came with Maple and began setting out the day's portions, he moved to help without being asked, lifting the panniers from the horse's back with the experienced ease of a man who has handled heavy loads for decades. Hazel let him help. She did not remark on his presence or his absence in the preceding days. When everything was set up, and before the first people arrived, he stood on the other side of the table from her and said, looking at the organized rows of fruit rather than at her face, "Garfield Stone was my friend for 22 years. Hazel looked at him. "I knew you had stores up on that hill," he said. "Everybody knew. I chose not to come and ask." His jaw moved. "That was a choice I made." "I know," Hazel said. He looked up then. "Why didn't you come down sooner?" It was a fair question. She had thought about it every morning of these 8 days. "Because I was afraid of what Crane would do with it if I came down before I was ready," she said. "I waited until I thought I had enough leverage to distribute it myself, rather than have it taken from me and sold." She was quiet for a moment. "I waited too long." Walt Briggs looked at her for a while. Something in his face changed, a settling, as if something he had been holding up had been put down. "At least you came," he said finally. He stayed at the table all morning, helping with the heavy lifting and keeping order in the line with the natural authority of a man who had managed work crews in difficult conditions for 30 years. He did not perform contrition. He did not make speeches. He showed up and worked, which was the only language he had ever entirely trusted. Through the 5 weeks that followed, the pattern held. Hazel came down each morning. The food went out in measured portions. Children who had been pale and listless began to show color in their cheeks within days of eating the concentrated fruit. Workers at the mill, which Sawyer Mills attempted to reopen in the 3rd week of February, when it became clear the town needed the income, found that the trail cakes Hazel had sent specifically for the working men kept them on their feet through a full day's labor when nothing else could. Mills noticed this. He said nothing about it, but he noticed. Lucretia Mills did not come to the table herself for the first 12 days. She sent her housekeeper, which was the kind of solution that a woman of her particular social architecture could construct for herself, a way of receiving something she needed while maintaining the appearance of not needing it. On the 13th day, she came herself. She stood at the end of the line with her eyes fixed somewhere above Hazel's head, the way a person looks when they are trying to make the moment smaller than it actually is. Hazel handed her a bag of dried pear without comment. Lucretia took it. Her fingers closed around the top of the bag. She did not move away immediately. She stood holding the bag, and something moved through her expression that was not quite any one thing, but had elements of several. The collision of how she had thought about this woman and what this woman had actually turned out to be. She walked away without speaking, but she came back the next day, and the day after that. On March 9th, 96 days after the last supply train had reached Millhaven, a locomotive came through the mountain pass, trailing steam in the cold air behind it. Its cars were loaded with flour, coffee, salt, pork, canned goods, everything the town had been without since November. The whistle reached the valley before the train did, and the sound of it moved through Millhaven the way relief moves through a body that has been holding something too long, suddenly and completely. People came out of their houses into the road. Some of them wept. Some of them stood in silence. Walt Briggs stood outside his cabin and listened to the whistle and felt something release in his chest that he could not have named precisely. He had been carrying Garfield Stone in there for 5 weeks. Hazel heard the whistle from the hillside. She was in the shed checking the final inventory. There were 38 pounds left. She had distributed 194 pounds in 35 days to families she had measured and calculated and rationed for with the same careful attention she had given to the production of the fruit itself. She heard the whistle and stood in the shed for a moment. Ruth knocked on the open door. "Are you coming down?" Hazel closed the ledger. She looked at the 38 pounds on the shelves. She thought about Constance, about the autumn afternoons when the work was done and the cellar was full, about the specific satisfaction of that completion, which was never about triumph over anything, but simply about the job having been finished. "They have what they need now," she said. "I have work to do up here." Ruth looked at her. "There's going to be a town meeting," she said. "Sunday, at the church." Hazel nodded. "I know." The Sunday meeting was held in the church, the largest building in Millhaven, and every person who had survived the winter came. They filled the pews and the standing room along the walls and the space near the door. The stove at the front had been burning since morning, and the room was warm in a way that a room can only be warm when warmth is no longer something you take for granted. Fletcher Crane asked to speak first. He walked to the front of the room with the deliberate step of a man who has made a decision and intends to carry it through regardless of how it feels. He was not the man who had stood behind his counter in November with the practiced ease of commercial authority. He was a man who had spent 5 weeks standing at a window, watching his own inadequacy made visible from the outside, and who had arrived through that watching at something that was not comfortable but was more honest than anything he had said in years. He stood at the front and looked at the room. 3 years ago, he said, a woman came into my store. She had a bag of dried apple rings. She asked to sell them from a table outside my door on market days. He stopped. His red beard moved. I refused her. I told her people wanted proper goods from proper companies. I told her homemade fruit from a hillside shed was below the standard of my establishment. He looked around the room slowly. My establishment spent 3 months with nothing on its shelves but dust and the memory of what used to be there. He did not look for sympathy in what he was saying. His voice had the quality of a man reading from a document he has written himself slowly and accurately. I raised the price of flour to $12 a sack because I could, because people had no other choice. I told myself it was business. It was not business. It was the behavior of a man who confused having the only supply with having the right to do whatever he chose with it. He paused. The woman I refused, the woman this town called mad, the woman whose shed we named after her supposed insanity, that woman fed your families when I could not. She fed my family though I had given her every reason to let us go hungry. He turned and found Hazel in the room. She was sitting near the back in the seat she had occupied every Sunday since her first winter in Millhaven, the end of a pew near the door, the place a person sits when they are not entirely sure they belong somewhere but have decided to show up anyway. "Mrs. Warren," he said, "I was wrong about your fruit, wrong about your methods, and wrong about you. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I'm asking for it anyway." He walked back to his seat. The room was quiet in the way a room is quiet when something that has been true for a long time has finally been said out loud. Sawyer Mills stood next. He was not a man accustomed to smallness in public, but he was a man who had been watching his workers eat from Hazel Warren's table for 5 weeks, and he was a man whose wife had come home from the distribution table on the 13th day holding a bag of dried pear, and had sat down at the kitchen table and cried in a way he had not seen her cry in 20 years of marriage. He asked her what was wrong, and she said, "It tastes like summer. I forgot what summer tasted like." And something in that sentence had found a way through the particular armoring that men like Sawyer Mills construct around themselves over decades of being certain. "My wife told your circle that your work was unsanitary and eccentric," he said to Hazel. "My wife ate your pears last month and wept because they were the most beautiful thing she had tasted in months." He shook his head. "I called your work a small, sad project from a small, sad life. I was describing my own character, not yours. I was wrong." Other people spoke. Mothers who had watched their children regain color and energy within days of eating the dried fruit. Men from the mill who described the effect of the trail cakes on their ability to work through a full day when their bodies had been running on almost nothing. An older woman who said simply that she was alive because a stranger had prepared for her welfare before the stranger had any reason to consider her at all. Deputy Hale stood briefly. He did not make a speech. He looked at Hazel and said, "I'm sorry about the inspection order." Then he sat down. Walt Briggs did not stand. He sat in his pew with his large hands resting on his knees, and when other people finished speaking and the room turned toward the back where Hazel sat, he turned with them. His face was not the face of a man who has been absolved. It was the face of a man who is learning to carry something more carefully than he has carried things before. When all the confessions and the acknowledgments and the expressions of debt had been offered, the room turned toward the back of the church, toward the woman who had produced the thing that had kept them alive, waiting for whatever she would say. Hazel stood up. She was not tall. She had never been tall. But the way she stood, the specific quality of her uprightness, the absence of performance or preparation in it, filled the room in a way that had nothing to do with physical presence. "My mother taught me to dry fruit," she said, "and her mother taught her. That's the whole of it." She looked at the faces in the pews, men who had laughed at her, women who had called her mad, children who had stood at her table in the cold with the faces of people receiving something that ought not to exist. She looked at all of them without hurry. "I didn't fill that shed to prove anything," she said. "I filled it because I was taught that waste is an offense. Every autumn fruit fell from trees all over this valley and rotted on the ground. Good food given to the mud and the weather, while this town put its faith in a train schedule printed by men in Portland who had never spent a winter on this side of the mountains. She paused. Something in her voice changed, became quieter, more considered. But I need to say something else. When Mr. Stone died, and when that little girl died, I was sitting in my shed with enough food to have prevented it. Maybe. I don't know for certain. I was waiting because I was afraid that if I came down too soon, Mr. Crane would find a way to take control of the distribution and turn it into a transaction.